The morning the 12 mares came off the trailer, it was the second Tuesday of September in 2019, and the sky was the color of old tin, that flat gray that means no rain, just heat, pushing down on you like a hand. I remember the dust hanging in the air behind the auction truck, and the way it didn't settle for a long while because there wasn't any moisture left in the ground to pull it down. We'd been dry going on 2 years by then, and everybody in the county knew it. And everybody had a number for how bad it was. The extension man had a number. The co-op had a number. The bank surely had a number. I had a number too, and mine was $45, because that is what I paid for 12 starving mares that nobody else in that sale barn would put a hand up for. I want to be honest about that price right at the start, because it sounds like a story I made bigger later. And it isn't. $45 for the lot. The auctioneer near about gave them away because the alternative was the killer buyer. And the killer buyer had already stepped out to his truck to make a call. And there was a long quiet moment where nobody said anything, and those mares just stood there in the ring with their hip bones showing and their heads hung low. And I put my hand up because I couldn't stand to watch it. That's the plain truth of why I did it that first second. But underneath the plain truth there was another reason. Older and quieter. And I'll get to that. They were in bad shape. I won't pretty it up. You could count every rib on the worst of them, and the worst of them was a bay I later took to calling Old Girl, because she was the eldest and the boniest, and she had a way of standing between the younger ones and any trouble. 12 head, all mares, ages. I'd guess ran from about 4 up to maybe 16, though it was hard to tell with the older ones because starvation ages a horse the way drought ages a field, faster than the calendar does. Their coats were dull and staring, the hair standing up off the skin instead of lying flat, which is a thing you learn to read, and it tells you the animal has been cold at night on an empty stomach for a long stretch. Their hooves were long and cracked and chipped up at the toes because nobody had trimmed them in a year, at least, and they were quiet, which is the part that stayed with me. A healthy horse is a busy, opinionated creature, always got something to say about the wind or the feed or the horse next to it. These 12 came off that trailer and just stood, saving what little they had, and that is a kind of quiet you don't forget once you've seen it. Now the man who ran the sale barn, he was polite about it, they mostly are, and he came over while I was signing the paper, and he looked at those mares in my little stock trailer, and he looked at me, and he said, real gentle, like he was doing me a kindness, you know what you're taking on there. It wasn't a question. He knew what it cost to bring an animal back from that far down, and he knew what my place looked like. 40 acres of dried-up bottom ground on the wrong side of a ridge, ground that everybody agreed had gone to nothing in the drought. And I said, I've got some ideas. Which was a thing to say when you don't have a good answer. And he knew that too, and he just nodded and let it go, and told me to have somebody look at the old bay before I got too attached, because she likely wouldn't make the winter. I told him I'd bear that in mind. And I drove home slow, the way you drive slow when you've got 12 half-dead horses shifting their weight in a trailer behind you, going up the county road with the dust rising and not settling. And I'll admit that somewhere around the 3rd mile I started asking myself what in the world I thought I was doing. Because here is the thing that made it foolish, and I want to lay it out honest, so you understand what everybody saw when they looked at me. My place couldn't feed 12 horses. Nobody's place around there could have fed 12 horses that year without buying hay. And hay had gone from $4 a bale to $11 a bale on account of the drought, and everybody was hauling it in from 3 counties over. My own 30 head of cattle were down to bones and water themselves, and I'd already sold off a third of them in July just to keep the rest going. There wasn't grass. There wasn't standing water except a mud hole down in the far bottom that was more crack than water by September. The stock tank up by the house ran off a well that was giving me maybe half of what it used to, and the well man had already been out and shaken his head and told me the aquifer was down and there wasn't anything to do but pray for rain and pump less. So a reasonable man, a man being careful, would not have added 12 more mouths and 12 more sets of hooves needing water to a place that already couldn't water what it had. I knew all that. I knew it in the trailer on the way home. And I bought them anyway. And the reason I bought them anyway is the older, quieter reason, and it had to do with my father, who had been dead by then 11 years, and a thing he'd said to me one time when I was a boy standing in that same far bottom that I had never once understood. My father farmed that ground his whole life and his father before him, and the story in our family was that the far bottom, the low 40, on the wrong side of the ridge, had been settled first before the good high ground up top, and everybody always said that was because the first people were fools who didn't know a good field from a bad one. My father never said that. My father, when the subject came up, would get a look on his face like a man deciding whether to tell you something, and mostly he decided not to. But this one time, and I was maybe 9 or 10, so this would have been around 1961. We were down in the far bottom in a dry stretch, not a drought like this last one, but a dry August in 1961, and the whole place was brown and hard, and I asked him why the old people would build down here in the low ground where it was so dry. And he stood there a while, and then he pointed off to a spot near the base of the ridge where there was a scatter of gray rock coming up out of the dirt, big flat stones, half buried, and he said, "They didn't build down here because they were fools. They built here because they knew where the water was. It's down there yet. It doesn't care about the sky." And I said, "What do you mean it's down there?" And he said, "You'll figure it out or you won't," which was the kind of thing he said. And then he changed the subject, and we went back up to the house, and I never once figured it out, and he never once brought it up again. And then years went by, and he got old, and he died in the spring of 2008, and I buried him, and I did not think about that afternoon in the far bottom for a very long time. What put it back in my head was the horses. Because the second day I had them, I turned them out into the far bottom, that low 40, on purpose. And I did it for a bad reason, and it led me to a good one. The bad reason was that the far bottom was the ground I'd already given up on. My cattle were up top on what little grass I had left, and I wasn't about to crowd 12 strange, starving horses in with them, so I put the mares down in the played-out bottom where there was nothing much to eat, and that mud hole for water, figuring I'd haul feed and water to them down there and keep them separate till I knew whether they'd live. So I turned 12 horses loose onto 40 acres of the deadest ground I owned, and I went back up to the house, and I didn't think much more about it that day. And the next morning I came down before 5, with the truck loaded with hay headlights cutting through the dark, and I found the whole band of them, all 12, clustered up tight against the base of the ridge, right in that scatter of gray rock my father had pointed at 58 years before, back in 1961. Standing there in the dark with their heads down, and they weren't eating because there wasn't anything to eat there, and they weren't sleeping, they were doing something to the ground. And I sat in that truck with the engine running, and I watched them, and I got a feeling on the back of my neck that I can't fully explain to you, except to say it was the feeling of a thing my father said, coming back around after 58 years and asking me a question. I want to be careful here, not to make more of that first morning than there was, because I've told this story enough times now, and I've learned that by the time a story like this gets told at the diner, it grows. And by noon the diner had a version, and the version had the horses digging with shovels. What they were actually doing was pawing. A horse paws at the ground, for all kinds of reasons. Everybody who's kept them knows that. They paw when they're impatient, or bored, or looking for feed, under snow. And I told myself that first morning that's all it was. They smelled the hay in the truck and got impatient. But it wasn't the truck they were pawing at. It was the base of the ridge, and it wasn't one or two of them. It was the whole band, and they'd worn a bare patch in that hard ground overnight that I could see even in the headlights. So I fed them, and I hauled them water in the big tank on the flatbed, because the mud hole was no good, and all the while I kept looking over at that bare patch by the rock, and I couldn't shake my father's voice. "It's down there yet. It doesn't care about the sky." And that is the thing I did not understand as a boy and started, just barely to understand as an old man standing in a dry bottom, watching 12 horses. Nobody wanted paw at the one spot on 40 acres that they, by some instinct older than any of us, had picked out in a single night in the dark. I fed them, and I watered them, and I went back up to the house, and I did not go get a shovel, and I want to own that, because it's the part I'm least proud of. I had the answer forming in front of me, and I put it off. I told myself I was too busy. And I was busy. A man that dry has 100 jobs a day just keeping stock alive. But the truth is, I put it off because I wasn't ready to be right. Because if my father had known something about that ground my whole life, and I'd never listened, then a lot of dry years I'd suffered through up top, or years I hadn't needed to suffer. And a man doesn't rush toward a truth like that. So the horses pawed, and I watched, and the days went by. And it was near 3 weeks before I did the one simple thing I should have done the first morning, which was go down there with a shovel and my father's old notebook and dig. I should tell you about the notebook now, because it's the other half of this, and I'd had it 11 years without ever really reading it. When my father died, we cleaned out the barn, and in the bottom of an old wooden toolbox, under a busted hand drill and a coffee can of rusted bolts, there was a composition book, the marbled black and white kind school kids used to carry, soft at the corners from being handled, the cover gone gray and greasy from barn hands. Inside it was my father's writing, and his father's before him, because the first pages were in an even older hand, pencil gone brown, and it was mostly just records. The plain bookkeeping of a farm, dates and rain, and which cow calved and what corn made per acre going back decades. I'd flipped through it once, when he died, gotten a lump in my throat at his handwriting, and put it up on a shelf in the house and left it there. But the morning I finally decided to go dig, some instinct told me to bring it, and I sat at the kitchen table, under the one bulb over the sink, before daylight, and I read it proper for the first time, page by page. And I found the thing. It was maybe 2/3 of the way through, in my grandfather's older brown pencil hand, a short entry with no year on it that I could match. And it said, and I'll give it to you the way it was written, dug out the rock spring in the bottom again. Water, good and cold. Runs strong all summer, even the dry years. Grandfather says it never fails. Covered it back over proper before I left. And then underneath, in that same brown pencil, underlined once, a single line, never fails. Do not let it fill in. And I sat there, at that table a long while, with that book open under the bulb, and outside it was starting to gray up toward morning, and I understood finally at 67 years old what my father had pointed at when I was 10. There had been a spring in the far bottom, a rock spring, an old developed spring, dug out and used by my people going back 3 generations at least. Cold water that ran strong all summer even in dry years, because it wasn't rain-fed. It came up from below, from deep, and it did not care about the sky. And somewhere along the line, probably after my grandfather passed, nobody had kept it dug out, and it had filled in with dirt and silt, and the years, and the low ground everybody called played out, had a well of cold living water sitting right under it that not one soul living had thought about in 50 years. Except the horses had thought about it. In one night in the dark, half-starved, they'd walked 40 acres and put their noses down on the exact spot. Now I'll tell you what happened when I went down there that morning with the shovel and the notebook, because this is where a careful man has to be careful, and I was not going to let myself believe it until I had it in my hands. The horses were at the rock, same as every morning, and they moved off a little when I came down, but not far. And I stood at the bare patch they'd worn, and I looked at the ground, and I want you to understand, there was nothing to see. It was dry, it was hard, it was gray dirt over flat gray stone, the deadest-looking dirt on the place. If you'd walked me to that spot cold and asked me to bet money there was water under it, I'd have laughed at you, the way the sale barn man laughed at me, gentle and sure. But I dug. And the first foot was hard as a road, and I got to sweating and cussing and thinking I was a fool chasing a dead man's riddle. And then the shovel changed sound. About 18 inches down, the dirt went from that dry, gray hardpan to something darker and heavier, damp, the kind of soil that has water moving somewhere near it, and the smell came up, that mineral cold water smell. And I stopped and I set the shovel down and I knelt and put my hand in the hole, and the dirt was cool and wet. What in the middle of the worst drought in 40 years? What 18 inches down in the ground everyone had written off. And I kept digging careful. Now gentle, the way you dig when you're afraid of breaking something. And about 3 feet down, I hit the rock. Not bedrock. Fitted rock. Flat stones set by a hand, laid up in a ring the way a man builds a spring box. My grandfather's hand or his father's. And between the stones the water was standing clear and cold. And as I cleared the silt out of it with my fingers, the water came up faster, filling in behind my hand, moving, alive, running strong all summer, even the dry years. Just like the book said. I sat back in that dry bottom with my wet hands and my heart going, and I did not feel like I'd found water. I felt like my father had reached across 11 years and set his hand on my shoulder. The horses came in while I sat there. That's a thing I'll carry. The old bay, old girl, the one the sale barn man told me to put down, she came up first. Slow and careful, and she put her nose down past my shoulder into that little pool of clear cold water, and she drank, and then the others came, 1 and 2 at a time, easy, no crowding, taking turns almost. And I sat right there in the mud, with 12 horses drinking around me from a spring. My family had forgotten, and a herd of starving animals had remembered in a single night. And I'll tell you plain, I'm not a man who cries easy, and I did not exactly cry, but it was a near thing. I spent the rest of that day digging the spring out proper, hauling off the silt, resetting the stones that had shifted, opening the old channel my grandfather had cut so the overflow ran off downhill instead of standing and going stagnant. And by evening I had a spring box maybe 4 feet across, brim full of cold water, with a steady little run coming out the low side, in September in a drought, on the ground nobody wanted. And I did the thing the notebook told me to do, the thing my grandfather underlined. I did not let it fill in. I've kept it dug out every year since word got around the way it does. I didn't broadcast it, but you can't run water in a dry country and keep it secret. And inside a week, the neighbors had heard the old man on the wrong side of the ridge had found water, and pretty soon there was a version at the diner where I'd hired a diviner with a forked stick, and another version where I'd struck an underground river and was going to sell water to the whole county. And the versions grew every day the drought held. And then the neighbor came. I won't name him, but you know the kind. Good enough man, drove a truck that was too clean for a working place. Always had the extension office's latest number ready to tell you why what you were doing wouldn't work. He'd been one of the ones back in September who'd let it be known around that I'd lost my judgment, buying dead horses to starve on dead ground. He came up the road on a Sunday and stopped his clean truck at my fence and rolled the window down, and I walked over, and he looked past me down at the far bottom where 12 horses, filling out now, their coats coming in, stood around a spring box that had a green ring of grass growing up around the overflow, the only green on 40 acres. And he was quiet a minute, and then he said, "That bottom's not as dead as it was, that's all." He didn't say he was wrong, and I didn't need him to. And he said, "You want to tell me how you knew that was there?" And I told him the truth, which is the thing that made him the most uncomfortable of anything I could have said. I told him I didn't know it was there. I told him the horses knew, and my grandfather knew, and I was the last one to know, and the only reason I found it was I paid $45 for 12 animals nobody wanted, and then I listened to what they did instead of telling them what they ought to do. He chewed on that a while, and then he allowed as how that was a lucky thing, and I let him have that word, lucky, because it costs a man like that less to say lucky than to say I was wrong. And he put his clean truck in gear and drove on. That was the concession. It wasn't much. It was plenty. I had a man out later that fall, a fellow who does groundwater work for the county, honest man, and I wanted to know what I actually had, so I'd manage it right, and he came out with his gear and tested the flow and the temperature and where the water was coming from, and he was down there a good while, quiet, kneeling by the spring box, running the numbers. And when he stood up, he had that look experts get. When the ground has told them something, the paperwork didn't. He said the spring was fed from deep, from a fracture in the rock that carried water down from the high country miles off, and that it had likely been running steady for longer than there'd been people to see it, and that a drought 2 years long or 10 years long wouldn't touch it because the water it was giving me now was rain that fell before I was born. He measured the flow at a little better than 3 gallons a minute, steady, which doesn't sound like much until you do the arithmetic, and find it's better than 4,000 gallons a day, every day, dry year and wet. More than enough for 12 horses and a good many head of cattle besides. Free? Coming up out of the ground on its own, with no pump and no power bill, and no well man shaking his head at me. He was quiet a while after he told me the number, and then he said, "The thing I keep." He said, "Whoever built this box knew exactly what they were doing. You don't find this by luck. Somebody read this ground a long time ago." And I said, "They did. My grandfather did. And I've got it written down." That winter, the winter the sale barn man told me, the old bay wouldn't live to see all. 12 mares came through it. Every one. They watered at that spring all winter long, and it never froze solid because water that comes up that deep comes up warm enough to keep a hole open in the cold, and they wintered better on my played-out bottom than my cattle did up top, and by spring they were sound, filled out, opinionated horses again, full of things to say about the wind. I moved the cattle down eventually, ran a line up from the spring to a new tank and let the high well rest, and my whole place changed on the strength of $45 and a notebook. I'd had 11 years and never read. I've thought a lot, since, about why my father never just told me plain. He knew. He could have walked me down and dug it out and showed me a boy. And I've come to believe he was doing what his own father did in that book, leaving it for whoever came after to earn. Because a thing you're handed you don't keep. And a thing you have to dig for, you keep the rest of your life. He said I'd figure it out, or I wouldn't, and I very near didn't. If those horses hadn't shown me, I'd have gone to my own grave with cold water, running under my worst field, and never known it. And the book would have gone in a box for my kids to not read either. So here is what I've come to, and then I'll let you go. We spend a great deal of our lives being told the number, the bank's number, the expert's number, the number that's supposed to end the conversation and tell you a thing, is dead and not worth your time, whether it's a field, or an animal, or a piece of old iron, or a piece of old knowledge. And the number is usually right about the surface and usually wrong about what's underneath, because the number only knows what fell from the sky lately, and it doesn't know what's been running deep and steady since before any of us got here. Those 12 mares were worth $45 by every number anybody could give me. But they carried an instinct in them older than the drought, and they walked onto the deadest ground I owned, and put their noses on living water in the dark. And they gave me back a spring my family had forgotten, and a field the drought couldn't kill. My father told me, "It's down there yet, and it doesn't care about the sky," and I didn't understand him for 58 years. And now I understand him every single day when I walk down and clear the silt out of that box and watch it fill back cold and clear behind my hand. Never fails. Do not let it fill in. That was his whole religion, near enough, and I've made it mine. If you've got a played-out field of your own, or an animal nobody else could see the worth in, or a notebook up on a shelf in an old hand you've been meaning to read, I'd be glad to hear about it down in the comments. And if this sat with you the way it sits with me, go on and subscribe, and I'll tell you another one. We move slow on this channel, but we get where we're going.